Judge mocks black defendant, shocked to learn she's the state's top prosecutor. How will this story turn out? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The courtroom was buzzing with quiet conversations, the scent of polished wood and old law books lingering in the air. It was just another routine day in Judge Walter Grayson's court, a place where he commanded authority, where his word was law, and where he made no secret of his disdain for certain defendants. He sat high on his bench, peering over his glasses at the young woman seated before him. Handcuffs clinked against the wooden table as she folded her hands, her posture composed despite the weight of the chains. The moment she had walked in, his expression had darkened. A black woman in an expensive-looking suit, sitting in the defendant's chair. He had already made up his mind about her. Judge Grayson smirked, tapping his gavel lightly. Well, look what we have here." The courtroom fell silent. The woman lifted her chin, her dark eyes locking onto his with unwavering confidence. "You know," Grayson continued, his tone almost mocking, "I've been on this bench for over 20 years, and I've seen all kinds of criminals come through my courtroom. But every once in a while, I see someone who thinks they're too good to be here. Someone who walks in with their head held high, thinking they're above the law." He leaned forward. "Tell me, Miss, what was your name again?" The woman remained silent for a long moment, letting the tension in the room build before speaking in a calm, measured voice. "Danielle Warren." Judge Grayson raised an eyebrow. "Danielle Warren," he repeated, pretending to think. "Doesn't ring a bell." A few muffled whispers broke out in the crowd. Grayson smirked. "Well, Miss Warren, according to this file, you've been charged with obstruction of justice and contempt of court. Quite the list of offenses." Danielle tilted her head slightly, as if studying him. "You seem awfully confident about that, Your Honor." The judge chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's exactly what I mean. This arrogance. You think you're smarter than me? You think that just because you walked in here wearing an expensive suit, you're different from the others I see every day." Danielle didn't flinch. Not once. "I don't think I'm smarter than you, Judge Grayson," she said smoothly. "I just happen to know the law very, very well." His smirk faltered for just a second. "Well, I'm afraid your knowledge won't help you much in here, Miss Warren, because in my courtroom I decide what happens. And from what I can see, you're just another criminal who thinks they can outsmart the system." He turned toward the bailiff. "Take her back to holding. I'll deal with her after lunch." But before the bailiff could take a step, another voice rang out from the back of the courtroom. "Your Honor, I would strongly advise against that." Every head turned toward the entrance. A man in a sharp gray suit strode forward, his presence commanding instant respect. Grayson frowned. "And who might you be?" The man reached into his pocket, pulled out an ID, and held it up for the entire courtroom to see. "Richard Holloway, Attorney General's office." The shift in the room was palpable. Grayson's smirk disappeared instantly. Richard Holloway was not someone you ignored. He had been in the legal field for decades and had the authority to overrule judges, prosecute misconduct, and oversee judicial ethics investigations. Grayson's throat went dry. "Mr. Holloway, what brings you to my courtroom?" Holloway's gaze flickered toward Danielle before locking back onto Grayson. "I came to ensure that the state's lead prosecutor isn't wrongfully detained." Silence. Absolute silence. Judge Grayson froze. His blood ran cold. He turned his eyes back to Danielle, who was now watching him with the faintest hint of amusement. "What?" Grayson choked out. Holloway took another step forward. "Danielle Warren is not a defendant. She is the state's chief prosecutor. And unless you'd like to explain why you've handcuffed one of the most powerful legal officials in this state, I suggest you remove those cuffs immediately." Murmurs exploded across the room. Gasps. Shocked whispers. Judge Grayson looked like he had been hit with a freight train. His face flushed red, then pale, then red again. His entire career flashed before his eyes. Danielle Warren, the woman he had just mocked and degraded, was not only innocent, she outranked him. He had treated one of the most powerful prosecutors in the state like a common criminal. And now, everyone in the room knew it. Danielle slowly leaned forward, resting her elbows on the table. "Judge Grayson, I believe we have a serious problem here." Grayson opened his mouth, but no words came out. Danielle's voice remained calm, steady, completely in control. "You assumed I was guilty the second I walked through that door. You assumed that because of how I look, I must be another criminal. You ridiculed me, belittled me, and violated my rights. All while sitting on that bench, pretending to uphold justice." Grayson swallowed hard, sweat beading at his temples. Danielle glanced at the stunned faces in the room. "You see, Your Honor, that's the difference between us. I know the law, I believe in it, I fight for it, and I expect it to be applied fairly for everyone." Her eyes locked onto his. "That includes me." The weight of her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. Judge Grayson knew, without a doubt, that his career was over. Holloway stepped closer, his expression unforgiving. "Your Honor, the Attorney General's office will be launching an official misconduct investigation into today's events. Your treatment of Miss Warren was not just unethical. It was a blatant abuse of power." Grayson's breath hitched. "Now, wait just a second." "No," Holloway interrupted, his tone sharp. "You wait. You will remain seated while we conduct an immediate review of your rulings over the past several years. And depending on what we find," he gave a pointed look, "you might want to consider early retirement." The tension in the room was suffocating. Danielle rose from her seat, the handcuffs clinking as the bailiff hurriedly unlocked them. She rubbed her wrists before stepping toward Grayson's bench, stopping just inches from him. "For years, you've abused this position," she said quietly. "But today, you finally answered to someone." And with that, she turned on her heel and walked out of the courtroom, leaving Judge Walter Grayson drowning in his own humiliation. The courtroom erupted the moment she stepped through the doors. And for the first time in his career, Judge Grayson was powerless to stop it. The aftermath of what had just unfolded in Judge Grayson's courtroom spread like wildfire. By the time Danielle reached her office, her phone was already flooded with calls and messages from reporters, legal professionals, and government officials. This wasn't just another courtroom incident. This was a scandal. Judge Grayson had openly mocked, belittled, and unlawfully detained the state's chief prosecutor. His actions had been witnessed by an entire courtroom, and now the legal world was demanding consequences. Danielle sat behind her desk, exhaling as she scrolled through the headlines. "State judge under investigation after wrongful detainment of top prosecutor. Judge Grayson accused of racial bias in courtroom incident. Legal expert. This could end his career." She leaned back in her chair, processing everything. Claire, her trusted assistant, burst through the door. "Danielle, have you seen?" Danielle held up a hand. "Yes, Claire, I've seen." Claire shook her head in disbelief. "This is insane. I mean, I knew Grayson was bad. But this? He just ended himself in front of a live audience." Danielle gave a small smirk. "He did." Claire sat across from her, still stunned. "So, what happens next?" Danielle exhaled. "The Attorney General's office will take it from here. Grayson's history is going to be picked apart, and I wouldn't be surprised if every single case he's ruled on in the last decade gets reviewed." Claire raised an eyebrow. "And you?" Danielle's expression hardened. "I'm going to make sure justice is served. The investigation begins." Within 48 hours, Judge Grayson was placed on indefinite leave pending an ethics investigation. The Attorney General's office assigned a full team to dig through his rulings, and what they found was worse than anyone had anticipated. Grayson's courtroom history revealed a disturbing pattern: disproportionately harsh sentencing for Black and Latino defendants, dismissive behavior toward female attorneys, and multiple complaints from defendants who claimed he treated them unfairly. One particular case stood out: a wrongful conviction from 5 years ago, one that had sent an innocent man, Terrence Booker, to prison for a crime he didn't commit. Danielle's hands tightened around the case file as she read through the details. Grayson had ignored exculpatory evidence, dismissed credible witnesses, and coerced a plea deal out of a young black man who had no legal representation. Danielle looked up, her eyes cold. "Get me in touch with Terrence Booker's lawyer. We're reopening this case." Claire nodded and immediately made the call. The public backlash. As news of Grayson's judicial misconduct spread, public outrage exploded. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, demanding his immediate removal from the bench. The legal community called for reforms to ensure judges like him were held accountable. And inside his house, Judge Walter Grayson sat alone, watching his career crumble in real time. His phone rang. It was his attorney. "You need to step down, Walter," the voice on the line said firmly. "The ethics committee is closing in. If you don't resign, you'll be forcibly removed." Grayson swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the receiver. "They can't do this to me." His lawyer sighed. "You did this to yourself." Grayson sat back, rubbing his temples. His decades of unchecked power were gone. He was no longer the feared judge who could intimidate defendants and attorneys alike. Now, he was just a disgraced man with nowhere to run. The reopening of Terrence Booker's case. 2 weeks later, Danielle stood in a different courtroom, this time as the lead prosecutor fighting to overturn a wrongful conviction. Terrence Booker sat beside his attorney, his hands shaking slightly as he listened. This was his last chance at freedom. Danielle turned to the judge. "Your Honor, new evidence has come to light, proving that Mr. Booker was convicted based on coerced testimony, falsified reports, and intentional judicial misconduct by Judge Grayson. We request that his conviction be overturned immediately." The judge reviewed the evidence before nodding gravely. "In light of this new information, the court vacates Mr. Booker's conviction." Terrence's eyes widened. I'm free." Danielle gave him a small, reassuring nod. "You're free." Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, "Thank you." In the back of the courtroom, reporters scribbled frantically. The headline was already being written. "Judge who mocked black prosecutor now responsible for wrongful conviction overturned. The final blow to Grayson." The very next day, Judge Walter Grayson officially resigned before he could be removed. His name was forever tarnished, his reputation destroyed. But for Danielle, this was just the beginning. She had fought for one innocent man today, but she knew there were countless others who had suffered under corrupt judges like Grayson. She wasn't going to stop. Danielle Warren was coming for them all, and this time they would answer to her. As the dust settled on Judge Grayson's resignation, Danielle found herself at the center of a legal firestorm. Her name was now being spoken in legal circles far beyond the state. Attorneys, lawmakers, and activists were reaching out, praising her for not only exposing Grayson but also for pushing forward a larger conversation about judicial accountability. She had expected some backlash. There were always those who resisted change, those who clung to the old system and resented anyone who dared challenge it. But even the harshest critics couldn't deny the facts. Grayson had abused his power for years, and it had taken someone like Danielle to finally bring him down. One morning, as she arrived at her office, Claire was already waiting for her with a stack of documents. "You're not going to believe this," Claire said, following Danielle inside. Danielle raised an eyebrow as she set her bag down. "Try me." Claire placed a thick file in front of her. Since the investigation into Grayson started, people have been coming forward with new complaints. Not just about him, about other judges, attorneys, even entire legal practices. Danielle flipped open the file, scanning the names. Some of them she recognized. Others were unfamiliar. But the accusations? They were disturbingly familiar. Biased rulings, coerced plea deals, evidence tampering. "This isn't just about one bad judge," Danielle murmured, her fingers tightening around the edge of the pages. "This is a pattern." Claire nodded. "And people are finally feeling safe enough to speak out. They saw what happened with Grayson, and now they know that justice is actually possible." Danielle exhaled slowly. She had known from the beginning that this fight was bigger than her. She hadn't taken on Grayson just to make an example out of him. She had done it because the system needed to change. And now, she had the chance to make that change permanent. She pulled out her chair and sat down, flipping through the cases. "We need to look at these carefully." Some of these are going to be major legal battles. We can't afford to take on cases we can't win." Claire smirked. "That's the thing. I've already started digging. Some of these, they're airtight. We're talking years of misconduct just waiting to be exposed." Danielle's eyes flickered over the names again, her mind already working through the possibilities. It was time to take this fight to the next level. The very next day, she called a press conference. A sea of reporters gathered outside the courthouse, microphones pointed, cameras rolling. The case against Grayson had already made headlines, but now they sensed something even bigger was coming. Danielle stepped up to the podium, clearing her throat before addressing the crowd. "For too long, we have allowed unchecked power in our judicial system. We have allowed judges and attorneys to act without accountability, to destroy lives with biased rulings and unethical practices. What happened with Judge Grayson was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a larger disease." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. This was no longer about one judge. This was about systemic corruption. She continued, her voice firm. "My office has received new evidence of judicial misconduct across multiple cases, spanning years. Effective immediately, we are launching a full-scale investigation into the court system to identify and remove those who have abused their power. This will not be easy. It will not be quick. But justice demands that we act." The reporters exploded with questions. How many cases are under review? Are other judges involved? Could we see more resignations? Danielle raised a hand. "We will follow the evidence wherever it leads. No one is above the law, not even those who wear the robe." The press conference aired on every major news channel. Within hours, social media was ablaze with discussions about judicial corruption, about the need for reform, about the bravery of those who were finally coming forward. Danielle sat in her office later that evening, staring at the screen as comments flooded in. Some were supportive, others skeptical, but one thing was clear. She had started something that couldn't be ignored. Her phone buzzed. "Claire again. You should turn on Channel 5, Claire said the moment Danielle answered. "Right now." Danielle grabbed the remote and flipped the station. The screen cut to a live interview. The guest? Judge Walter Grayson. Danielle sat up straighter, watching as the disgraced judge sat stiffly, his expression carefully controlled. The anchor wasted no time getting to the point. "Judge Grayson, your resignation has sparked national attention. Many are saying you stepped down to avoid further consequences. What do you have to say to those claims?" Grayson cleared his throat. "I stepped down because I believe in the integrity of the legal system. The media has twisted what happened in my courtroom. I did nothing wrong. I simply upheld the law as I always have." Danielle felt her blood boil. He wasn't just refusing to take responsibility. He was playing the victim. The anchor pressed further. "So you deny any misconduct? Even after the Attorney General's investigation?" Grayson's expression darkened. "This so-called investigation is a witch hunt. And let's be honest, it's being led by someone with a personal agenda." Danielle's fingers clenched into fists. He was talking about her. She didn't realize Claire was still on the phone until she spoke again. "You're not going to let that stand, are you?" Danielle took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "No," she said. "I'm not." The next morning, she made a direct response. Another press briefing. Another crowd of reporters. Danielle walked up to the podium, looked straight into the cameras, and spoke without hesitation. "Judge Grayson has accused me of having a personal agenda," she said. "He is absolutely right." A murmur ran through the crowd. "My agenda is justice. My agenda is holding people accountable for their actions. My agenda is ensuring that no one, is wrongfully convicted because of personal bias or corruption." She held up a thick folder of documents. "The evidence against Judge Grayson is undeniable. He can go on television and say whatever he wants, but the facts remain the same. And if he truly believes he did nothing wrong, then I invite him to face these findings in a courtroom." The challenge was laid. And Grayson? He never responded, because he knew, just like everyone else, that the moment he stepped into a courtroom, he would lose. Danielle didn't need him to admit defeat. He already had. As she walked back into her office, Claire met her with a knowing smile. That, Claire said, shaking her head in admiration, was a power move. Danielle exhaled, feeling the weight of everything that had happened. This wasn't just about Grayson anymore. It was about every judge, every attorney, every prosecutor who had abused the system and gotten away with it. But now, that era was over, and she was making sure of it. The ripple effect of Danielle's press conference was undeniable. Overnight, the judicial system had been thrust into the spotlight, forcing judges, attorneys, and legal officials across the country to reassess their actions. People who had once felt powerless against corruption were now coming forward, submitting complaints, and demanding accountability. Danielle had set something in motion that could not be stopped. Sitting in her office late one evening, she stared at the new stack of case files that had landed on her desk. Each file represented a person who had been failed by the system. Some wrongfully convicted, others forced into unfair plea deals, some denied justice because of who they were. Claire walked in, placing yet another file on the growing pile. This just came in from the Attorney General's office. They're moving forward with an official task force to review judicial misconduct statewide. Danielle let out a breath. That's fast. Claire nodded. You made it impossible for them to ignore. They don't want another Grayson situation on their hands. Danielle picked up the file, flipping through it. The task force was real. It had funding, investigators, and legal experts assigned to comb through years of questionable cases. This wasn't just a temporary fix. This was systemic reform in action. She had won. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was still unfinished business. Judge Grayson was no longer on the bench, but he was far from powerless. He still had influence, connections, and the ability to manipulate the narrative. His attempt to paint himself as the victim on national television had been a warning sign. He wasn't done fighting yet. Claire seemed to read her thoughts. You know he's not just going to fade away quietly, right? Danielle nodded. I know. The unexpected twist. A week later, the tension that had been lingering in the air finally boiled over. Danielle was in a meeting when her phone buzzed repeatedly. Claire's name flashed on the screen. She answered immediately. What's wrong? Claire's voice was sharp. Turn on the news. Right now. Danielle didn't hesitate. She grabbed the remote and flipped to the nearest news channel. And there he was, Judge Walter Grayson, standing on the steps of the courthouse, flanked by lawyers. A reporter's voice filled the room. In a shocking turn of events, former Judge Walter Grayson has announced that he is filing a lawsuit against the state for wrongful termination and defamation. Danielle froze. Grayson stood tall, his expression carefully composed as he addressed the press. I have served this state faithfully for decades, he said, his voice carrying a calculated arrogance. I have upheld the law and ensured that justice is served. And yet, I have been targeted, slandered, and wrongfully removed from my position. Not because I failed in my duty, but because of a personal vendetta. Danielle's grip on the remote tightened. Grayson continued, his voice laced with manipulation. I was forced out by an activist prosecutor who used her position not for justice, but for her own political gain. This is a dangerous precedent. If we allow prosecutors to take down judges just because they don't like their rulings, where does it end? Danielle could feel her blood boiling. He wasn't just trying to save his own reputation. He was trying to discredit her entire movement. The reporter spoke again. Danielle sighed. You know what the worst part is? You could have been a great judge. You had the power to help people, to ensure justice was actually served. But instead, you let your own biases control you. And because of that, innocent people suffered. Grayson looked away, shame flickering across his face. After a long pause, he muttered, I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought I was upholding the system. Danielle shook her head. No, you were upholding your version of the system. A system where people like me had to prove we belonged. A system where power mattered more than fairness. She took a deep breath. But that system is changing now. And whether you like it or not, that's a good thing. Grayson exhaled, running a hand over his face. I suppose it doesn't matter what I think anymore. Danielle tilted her head. That's where you're wrong. It does matter, because you have a choice. You can either disappear and live with what you've done, or you can own up to your mistakes and help fix the damage you caused. Grayson let out a bitter chuckle. And why would I do that? Danielle gave him a knowing look. Because if you really believed in justice, even a little bit, then you'd want to make this right. She didn't wait for his response. Instead, she walked away, leaving him to sit with the weight of his own choices. The final victory. Months later, the Judicial Integrity Act officially passed into law. Danielle stood in the governor's office, watching as the governor signed the bill into effect. The room was filled with legal reformers, lawmakers, and activists, people who had fought beside her to make this moment possible. When the final signature was placed on the document, the room erupted in applause. Danielle shook hands with the governor, her chest filled with pride. This wasn't just a win for her. It was a win for every person who had ever been wrongfully convicted, silenced, or denied justice. As she stepped out of the room, Claire caught up with her, her face beaming. "You just rewrote history," Claire said. Danielle smiled. "No, we all did." That evening, Danielle sat alone in her office, reflecting on everything that had happened. She had gone up against one of the most powerful men in the legal system. She had exposed corruption at the highest level. She had transformed the justice system from within. And yet, she knew this wasn't the end. There would always be more battles to fight, more injustices to uncover. But now, she was stronger than ever, and she was just getting started. As the months passed, the impact of the Judicial Integrity Act was felt across the country. Judges who had long operated without oversight were now being held accountable, wrongful convictions were being overturned, and legal professionals who had once feared retaliation for speaking out finally had a voice. The old system, the one built on unchecked power and silent corruption, was beginning to crumble. Danielle found herself at the heart of it all. Every day brought new challenges, new cases, and new people seeking justice. Her office had become a beacon for those who had once believed the system would never work for them. It was exhausting, relentless work, but she had never felt more certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. One afternoon, as she was preparing for yet another press conference, Claire walked in with a small envelope in her hand. Her expression was unreadable, which was unusual for her. "This came for you," she said, placing it on the desk. Danielle eyed the envelope cautiously before picking it up. There was no return address, just her name written in careful handwriting. She opened it, unfolding a single sheet of paper. The message was short, only a few sentences. "I don't expect forgiveness, but I wanted to say that you were right. About everything. I see that now. And for what it's worth, I hope the system you're building is better than the one I defended for so long. Good luck." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Danielle knew exactly who it was from. She let out a slow breath, folding the letter and setting it aside. Claire watched her carefully. "Was that from who I think it was?" Claire asked. Danielle nodded. "Grayson." Claire's eyes widened slightly. "Well, that's unexpected." Danielle gave a small shrug. "Maybe, maybe not. People change when they lose everything. Do you believe him?" Danielle was silent for a moment before she finally spoke. "I don't know, but I do know that acknowledging the problem is the first step to fixing it. And that's more than he was willing to do before." Claire nodded slowly. "So what now?" Danielle looked at the stack of cases on her desk, at the names of people still waiting for justice, at the work that was far from over. "Now," she said, standing up, "we keep going." And with that, she walked out of her office, ready to face whatever came next. Because justice wasn't just about one victory, one case, or one corrupt judge. It was about the fight that never ended, about standing up for what was right, no matter how long it took. And as long as she had breath in her body, Danielle Warren would keep fighting. Danielle barely had a moment to breathe after Grayson's letter. The world moved forward, and so did the fight for justice. Every morning, a new case file landed on her desk, another name of someone who had been denied their rights, another battle that needed to be fought. The Judicial Integrity Act had passed, but now came the difficult part, enforcing it. Some judges had resigned quietly before they could be investigated. Others were fighting tooth and nail to keep their power, filing appeals, attempting to dismiss complaints, and calling in favors from old allies. Danielle wasn't surprised. Corruption doesn't just disappear overnight. One morning, she was in the middle of reviewing a particularly complex case when Claire burst into her office, looking more animated than usual. "You're not going to believe what's happening right now," she said, placing her phone on the desk and hitting play on a news broadcast. Danielle leaned forward, watching as the screen cut to a familiar face. Judge Harold Monroe, one of the longest-serving judges in the state. He had spent decades on the bench, making rulings that disproportionately affected marginalized communities. And now, he was standing on the steps of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters, announcing his resignation. "I have served this court for over 30 years, Monroe said, his voice tight with frustration. "And in those years, I have always ruled with fairness and integrity. But due to the unfair scrutiny brought upon our judiciary by activists with personal agendas, I have made the difficult decision to step down." Danielle scoffed. "Unfair scrutiny? He's stepping down because he knows he's next." Claire nodded. "Apparently, he's been dodging complaints for years, but with the new oversight committees in place, they finally have enough to open an official investigation. Rather than risk a formal hearing, he's choosing to walk away first." Danielle leaned back, processing it. Another one down. Another example of the old guard crumbling under the weight of their own misdeeds. "What happens to his cases?" she asked. "They're being reviewed. Some are already flagged for potential bias." Danielle nodded. That was what mattered most. It wasn't just about forcing corrupt judges out. It was about undoing the damage they had done. Judge Grayson's lawsuit seeks reinstatement to the bench, as well as financial damages for lost wages and defamation. Danielle could hardly believe what she was hearing. Grayson had the audacity to claim he was the victim, after everything he had done. Claire's voice cut through the chaos. "What are we going to do?" Danielle inhaled deeply, forcing herself to think clearly. "He wants a fight?" she said. "Then we'll give him one." The legal battle begins. The lawsuit exploded into the national spotlight. Legal analysts debated it on television. Columnists wrote opinion pieces about what this meant for judicial oversight. Some judges, terrified of facing their own scrutiny, sided with Grayson, calling it an attack on the judiciary. Danielle, however, wasn't backing down. Her office assembled a team of legal experts to fight back. They compiled evidence, gathered testimonies, and laid out Grayson's long history of misconduct in preparation for what would undoubtedly be a brutal legal battle. The Attorney General's office, now deeply involved in the case, publicly condemned Grayson's lawsuit, calling it an attempt to manipulate the system after being exposed. Danielle gave a single, powerful statement to the press. "This lawsuit is nothing more than a desperate attempt to regain power that was rightfully stripped away. The evidence against Judge Grayson is clear, and we will not allow him to silence the voices of those who suffered under his rulings." Her words struck a nerve. Protests erupted outside the courthouse. Citizens who had been victims of biased rulings under Grayson gathered, sharing their stories, demanding permanent judicial reforms. For the first time, it wasn't just Danielle against Grayson. It was the people against corruption. And that was a battle he couldn't win. The final blow. 3 months later, the case reached its climax. Inside the courtroom, Grayson sat at the plaintiff's table, his expression unreadable. Across from him, Danielle stood firm, her presence unshaken. The judge presiding over the case, a fair and respected federal judge, began reading the final ruling. After reviewing the evidence presented, this court finds that Mr. Grayson's claims of wrongful termination and defamation are without merit. A hush fell over the room. The evidence overwhelmingly supports the Attorney General's findings of judicial misconduct. The plaintiff's motion for reinstatement is denied, and his defamation claim is dismissed with prejudice. Danielle could see it, the exact moment Walter Grayson realized it was over. His jaw clenched, his hands curled into fists, his once unshakable confidence shattered in front of the entire courtroom. He had lost, completely. As the judge continued, Danielle remained still, absorbing every word. This ruling should serve as a reminder that no one is above accountability. Not even those who sit on the bench. When the final gavel struck, the room erupted. Danielle turned to see victims of Grayson's past rulings wiping away tears of relief. Activists celebrating, legal officials nodding in agreement. It was done. Grayson stood slowly, his face pale, his career in ruins. As he walked past Danielle, he didn't dare meet her eyes, because he knew she had won, and justice had prevailed. That evening, as Danielle stepped out of the courthouse, she was met with a sea of people. Citizens, former defendants, legal reform advocates. They cheered as she walked past, some shaking her hand, some simply whispering, "Thank you." Claire appeared beside her, a rare look of awe on her face. "You just changed everything," Claire murmured. Danielle gazed at the crowd, at the lives that had been impacted, at the movement she had ignited. "No," she said softly, a small but triumphant smile forming on her lips. "We all did." The weeks that followed Judge Grayson's downfall were monumental. His defeat in court wasn't just a personal loss. It was a turning point in the justice system. The case had forced lawmakers, legal professionals, and the general public to reconsider how much unchecked power judges truly had. The Attorney General's office, spurred by the overwhelming evidence of widespread judicial corruption, announced a full-scale investigation into judicial misconduct, not just in Grayson's courtroom, but across the entire state and beyond. Danielle knew she had set something unstoppable in motion. She had gone from being wrongfully detained in a courtroom to becoming the face of a legal revolution. One morning, she walked into her office to find Claire already waiting for her, a fresh stack of documents in her hands. Claire smirked. "So, you're officially the most talked about prosecutor in the country. How does it feel?" Danielle sighed, dropping her bag onto her desk. "It feels like I haven't had a full night's sleep in months." Claire chuckled, setting the files down. "Well, no rest for the righteous." The Attorney General's office is pushing for new legislation to prevent future Grayson-like abuses. They're calling it the Judicial Integrity Act. And guess who they want as the lead advisor on the reform committee? Danielle blinked. "You're kidding?" Claire shook her head. "Not even a little. They want you to help draft it." For a moment, Danielle was speechless. She had spent her entire career fighting to hold corrupt officials accountable. And now, she had the power to rewrite the very laws that had allowed them to get away with it for so long. She exhaled, a slow, determined smile forming. "Tell them I accept." Claire grinned. "I thought you might say that, the beginning of reform." In the months that followed, Danielle worked tirelessly with lawmakers, legal scholars, and civil rights advocates to shape the Judicial Integrity Act. The proposed law aimed to implement stronger oversight of judicial decisions, mandatory reviews for judges with patterns of bias or misconduct, more accessible avenues for citizens to file complaints against judges, harsher penalties for judges caught abusing their power. The bill quickly gained momentum, fueled by the public outrage that had followed Grayson's scandal. For too long, people had believed that judges were untouchable, that no matter how unfair or unethical they were, there was nothing anyone could do. Danielle had shattered that illusion, and now she was making sure that no one else would ever have to fight the same battle she had. A face-to-face encounter. One afternoon, as she was leaving the courthouse, Danielle unexpectedly came face-to-face with Walter Grayson. He was sitting alone on a bench outside, looking smaller than she had ever seen him. The once feared judge, the man who had mocked and ridiculed her in his courtroom, now looked defeated, broken. Danielle could have walked past him. She owed him nothing, but something made her stop. Grayson looked up as she approached. His eyes were tired, his face lined with stress and regret. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he let out a dry chuckle. "I suppose I should say congratulations." Danielle crossed her arms. "For what?" He shrugged. "Winning, destroying my career, turning me into the poster child for judicial corruption." Danielle studied him carefully. "I didn't destroy your career, Grayson. You did that all on your own." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. As she turned back to her own case files, Claire hesitated. "There's something else," she said carefully. "I think you should see this." She placed another document on the desk, a thick manila folder marked confidential. Danielle opened it, her eyes scanning the first page. It was a sealed complaint filed years ago, one that had been buried under red tape and never properly investigated. And at the center of it, Grayson. Danielle frowned. "What is this?" Claire sighed. "It's from a case nearly 10 years ago. A young man named Jordan Hayes. He was sentenced to 20 years for armed robbery, despite there being little evidence against him. The case was handled by Grayson and, well, let's just say the details are suspicious." Danielle flipped through the pages. The case had relied on a single witness with an inconsistent story, and there had been no forensic evidence linking Jordan Hayes to the crime. He had been offered a plea deal of 5 years, but when he refused, insisting he was innocent, Grayson handed down the maximum sentence. Her jaw tightened. This wasn't just about misconduct. This was about a man whose life had been stolen. She looked up at Claire. "Where is he now?" Claire hesitated. "Still in prison." Danielle exhaled slowly. "Get me everything we have on this case," she said, her voice firm. "We're getting him out." Hours later, Danielle sat across from Jordan Hayes in a small visitation room inside the state penitentiary. He was 34 now, a man who had spent the past decade behind bars for a crime he swore he didn't commit. His eyes were sharp but wary, his shoulders tense as if he were bracing for another disappointment. Danielle placed the case file in front of her. "Mr. Hayes," she began, "I'm here because I believe you were wrongfully convicted, and I want to help you prove it." Jordan let out a bitter chuckle, leaning back in his chair. "You're about 10 years too late." Danielle didn't flinch. "I understand why you'd feel that way, but things are different now. Judge Grayson is gone. The system that let this happen is being dismantled, and I have the power to reopen your case." Jordan studied her carefully. "You're serious?" "I am." For the first time, hope flickered in his expression. "What do you need from me?" "Tell me everything," she said. "Every detail you remember." And so he did. For the next 2 hours, Jordan recounted everything. How he had been arrested without proper cause. How his defense attorney had been overworked and underprepared. How Grayson had treated him with open hostility in court. Danielle listened to every word, her anger growing with each revelation. She had known Grayson was corrupt, but this was something else entirely. By the time the meeting ended, she had everything she needed to start tearing this case apart from the inside. As Jordan was led back to his cell, he turned to her one last time. "Do you really think you can get me out of here?" Danielle met his gaze, unwavering. "I don't think," she said. "I know." The fight to overturn Jordan's conviction was one of the hardest Danielle had ever faced. The evidence against him had been weak, but that didn't mean the system would easily admit it had been wrong. There were legal barriers, old bureaucratic roadblocks that had kept cases like his buried for years. And there were people in power who wanted to protect the rulings of judges like Grayson, even after he was gone. But Danielle had come too far to back down now. She pushed. She filed motions. She challenged every false claim in the original case. And after months of relentless work, she won. The day Jordan was released, the courtroom was packed. People who had been following the case held their breath as the judge delivered the final ruling. This court finds that the conviction of Jordan Hayes was based on insufficient and unreliable evidence. His sentence is hereby vacated, and he is to be released immediately. The room erupted. Danielle turned to Jordan, who sat frozen for a moment, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Then, slowly, he exhaled, his hands trembling as he ran them over his face. He was free. And Danielle? She had just undone one of Grayson's greatest injustices. Outside the courthouse, Jordan stepped into the sunlight for the first time in a decade. He looked around, taking in the sight of the world he had been kept from for so long. Danielle stood beside him. "How does it feel?" Jordan took a deep breath. "Like I can finally breathe again." Claire appeared, holding up her phone. "You're all over the news already. Everyone's talking about this." Danielle nodded. "Good, because this wasn't just about Jordan Hayes. This was about every single person still trapped in the system Grayson and others like him had built. and she wasn't stopping until they all had justice.